This version of To My Way of Thinking features a journalist that I have admired for quite some time. His work and his coverage of events and personalities around the state of Florida in particular have been well worth reading. So joining us today is A.G. Gancarski, who writes principally now for FloridaPolitics.com. Thanks for joining us, A.G.
Hey, thank you, Frey, for having me on.
Well, it's an interesting time for political writers like yourself and journalists who follow what's taking place, and who are allowed to follow all the events of today. So let's take it from a statewide perspective first, because you do get a chance to see some of that. What's happening around the state, south, western part of the state, and of course up here north, and we have to distinguish what happens in the northeastern part of the state from what happens in the north, in the panhandle, because they're two different personalities. So what's happening around the state? What are you seeing?
Well, it's interesting because obviously on the state level, the big story has been Governor DeSantis running for president, and, whether he can get traction against Donald Trump, it's not looking likely. So now people are kind of looking ahead to what happens when Ron DeSantis comes back. He obviously got a lot of priority items through hard right conservative legislation the last couple of years. But when he comes back to Tallahassee 2024, presumably having lost the presidential race, you kind of wonder what he's going to do. So he'll be a lame duck at that point. People will start to run for governor, like Matt Gaetz is already looking at it. So when I look at what's happening at the state level, I'm looking at how Ron DeSantis relates to the rest of the state, because he's been a dominant governor, but that seemed to be a prelude to a presidential run that hasn't panned out. Tying that into local stuff, I mean, obviously with Mayor Deegan being a Democrat, it's not the same vibe as it was when Lenny Curry was there. Curry and DeSantis, they worked well together. I think Curry and Rick Scott worked better still together. But with the Democratic mayor, you don't have the Republican big city that DeSantis or Rick Scott or a future Republican governor can go to. So it's interesting to see how that works. I'm curious to see how appropriations come through for Jacksonville in upcoming legislative sessions with Deegan as mayor. Given the reality that it's going to be a supermajority Republican legislature, our Democrats, Angie Nixon, Tracy Davis, Kim Daniels, to a lesser extent, get frustrated in chasing appropriations. So I'm curious to see if Jacksonville actually gets sort of big projects, kind of like the University of Florida campus that was appropriated earlier this year. So that's kind of what I'm watching. We've had changes on both the state and local levels, and, seeing how the politics work out, the personalities play out, that's going to be the big picture for the next couple of years.
When I look at, since you mentioned the DeSantis administration, we'll go a little deeper into that. Obviously, when he was a congressman, here locally, he didn't garner that much attention. Many of his colleagues viewed him as being fairly moderate and quiet in Congress. But of course, all of that, having gotten the incentive to run for governor, it worked out. The first term was sort of middle of the road, I guess you say that. Nothing big, but obviously, when the opportunity came and there was more people pushing him to run for president, the politics changed a great deal. How do you perceive that the DeSantis government has changed the way politics is conducted or perceived around the state?
Yeah, I mean, as you hint with your question, there's several different phases to the DeSantis administration. I think the first year he was actually fairly moderate in comparison to Rick Scott. He actually allowed things like smokable medical marijuana. That was something Rick Scott fought. He did environmental things. He seemed to be branding himself as a new style Republican. Once COVID-19 hit, first few months of that, he did sort of standard pandemic restrictions, closing bars, things like that. But as it got to be closer to the 2020 election, especially after Joe Biden won, he went very contrarian toward things like COVID-19 mitigation. And he went harder right in terms of things like abortion legislation, death penalty legislation, those kinds of things. So he basically had that first year where he seemed like sort of a governor conscious that he won with a very slim plurality over Andrew Gillum. I mean, remember, we had recounts and everything else in that election. He sort of got comfortable in the position, and he took advantage of a legislature that was majority Republican the whole time, super majority Republican after 2022 elections. So a lot of things got through. The irony is with him running for president, some of the things got through, specifically the 6-week abortion ban, the Heartbeat Protection Act. That's been kind of a problem for him in places like New Hampshire and more liberal places, especially with open presidential primaries, because though a 6-week abortion ban may fly with Florida Republicans, and it may fly someplace like Iowa where you have a heavy evangelical population, someplace like New Hampshire where you have an open primary and less of an evangelical tradition, he's having to walk that one back a little bit and sort of tap dance around it. It's been DeSantis has been kind of a phased governor. When he was in Congress, kind of the same deal, because if you'll recall, he ran for Senate in 2016. He was frustrated in the House, and he felt running for Senate would be his move. Obviously, Marco Rubio decided to run for re-election, and DeSantis did another term of the House after that. But there seems to be like two Ron DeSantis. You've got the guy who is sort of a pragmatist until he gets an opportunity to go more hard right, and that's what he does.
Mm.
But like I say, like this next couple of years, it's gonna be interesting to see if he goes back to the persona he had the first year in office, or if he continues to play to the hard right flank of the party.
Well, he may be stuck where he is. That's what I would tend to think, and we often have to remind folks who are watching what's taking place that all of the activity that he's taken is all about getting the Republican nomination. It's to run for president, but it's about getting the nomination, because without the nomination, there is no presidency to run for. And so all of the action is about getting those Republicans on the right in particular, since the state is perceived to be more red than anything else, to get them to come behind him so that he can get that nomination. No nomination, it doesn't matter whether who runs for president, because it won't be him. What do you perceive as that being one of them? What do you perceive as the top 3 issues around the state? We've got a number of things that are facing folks here, residents in the state. But what do you perceive as the top 3 issues that the state is facing?
I think the top issue that people are facing in the state is the erosion of the middle class, the erosion of affordability, housing prices, insurance, utilities, groceries. They've all gone up. We basically have California prices with the Mississippi safety net right now. So when you look at things in those terms, people who weren't struggling, say 5 years ago, are struggling now. I mean, obviously, when you look at what's happened federally to the currency and the expansion of the money supply in recent years, that's had a downstream effect every place, but Florida's been hit particularly hard. So that's the number one issue. I think a secondary issue, but one that is probably just as important, especially for women, are things like the abortion issue. The fact that Florida went from having fairly accommodating abortion laws to a 15-week abortion ban, and then a 6-week abortion ban. It's a much tougher place to be a woman than it was just a couple years ago, because 6 weeks of pregnancy, you don't even know if you're pregnant yet, but the state is telling you, well, you don't have reproductive freedom. And I think that's a big deal. Beyond that, I mean, I look at things like environmental and infrastructural issues. The state's infrastructure has a lot of problems, ranging from roads to pipes. We see it locally, but we see it everywhere else too. And there doesn't seem to be budgetary will to do much about those issues. State's good in terms of reserves, things like that. But even when the state's been awash in money, that money's been used to maintain the status quo more than it has been to actually lift up people who need it the most. And I think that's sort of the legacy of 20th century or 21st century Florida politics, really. We've seen governor after governor. Chris is a Republican who was in, obviously, Rick Scott, Ron DeSantis, but it seems to be a trajectory where it's a great place to be a white upper middle class person over the age of 50, but for other people, not so much. We have equity issues in the state. They're not going away. In fact, they're being exacerbated.
Oh, among your top three there, number one being money issues, I would add a 1A to that, and that's the issue of the insurance crisis.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly for homeowners, but quite frankly, it's creeping there for car owners, but for homeowners. And, with the disasters that have taken place with the hurricanes over the last now 2 years and going into 3, the legislature took virtually no action to gain some relief for those persons. The only action, I guess you could say, that was taken is to staff up citizens insurance a bit. But other than that, there's virtually no change for this, and we're guaranteed another set of catastrophes come next spring and summer. Is there anybody that is championing this on the red side of the aisle in the coming legislative session, or is it just going to be forgotten?
Well, they did have a couple of special sessions to deal with insurance. They put $3 billion state funds into the reinsurance market, which basically bolsters the people who guarantee the insurance agencies. So that was kind of a way to stop the bleeding. They passed legislation to make it harder to challenge insurance companies, basically countering what they call fraud. It cuts down on consumer recourse, obviously, but that's a move they've made also. And they've been somewhat aggressive about bringing insurers in. These insurers are not able to match citizens' prices in most cases. The current way to carve out citizens' policies is if a private insurer offers you a policy that's no more than 20% higher than your citizens quote, then you have to move over to the private. So you're seeing private insurers absorbing the citizens' customer load over time. But these insurance companies have not been tested. I mean, Slide Insurance is one that people are getting routed to. And if you haven't heard of Slide until this conversation, you're not alone. A lot of people haven't heard of them until they get the notice from citizens saying, great news, we got private insurance for you. And they get a very limited amount of time to opt out of it. The idea is that Citizens is the insurer of last resort. So that's the state's position on it. Flood insurance is obviously an issue with the storms we had last year, particularly. People might have had wind mitigation insurance, they didn't have flood insurance. So a lot of people in Southwest Florida who had destroyed or damaged properties got no recourse. And of course, with the crackdown on illegal immigration, there seems to be a downstream effect in terms of contractors, because a lot of the subcontractors, they're not necessarily legal citizens. We kind of see in the agricultural realm too. So these are having downstream effects in terms of insurance companies and in terms of people being made whole after these storms. And I don't think the state has a fix for that at all. But if you listen to House Speaker Paul Renner, people like that, they'll say in a couple of years, things will get better. The big question, though, is do we have a couple of years to wait? We got lucky this storm season. Does it happen next year? These are, of course, open questions that I can't answer.
Well, along the line of contracting and subcontracting, especially getting the homes fixed and getting something as simple as used to be simple anyway. Getting
Right.
a roof put on your house, and couple that with the immigration issue. I've talked to a number of my neighbors and even here at my place, when the roof has to be fixed, aside from the owner of the company coming out and doing the first check and inspection, the next crew that's actually putting on the roof, doing the hammering and putting down the stuff, are all folks who speak Spanish.
Exactly.
And that is something that's happening throughout the atmosphere, in particular in construction. You would think it wouldn't be, but it is. And obviously, as you mentioned, the agricultural issue that we have here, and yet, it's popular to slam the immigration, to close the door on immigration, and make it harder for folks to work here when there are jobs that I say, quote, Americans, both black and white, they're jobs that we're simply not taking anymore. We're not picking oranges. We're not getting in the sun to do that work. Somebody has to come here and do it. And guess who?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and that's the story as old as America. I mean, when my grandfather came over from Poland, he was instantly like hauled to a coal mine. It was like lickety split like that, from Ellis Island straight to a coal mine in Pennsylvania. So it's always the case: legal immigration, illegal immigration, whatever it happens to be. They're doing jobs that more established generations don't want to do. And of course, you get to the idea of, payment and incentives. I mean, one of the reasons that, people from other countries are willing to do these jobs is because they're under the table and they're willing to live differently than, people who've been in this country a few generations. They'll live 8 or 9 people in an apartment, things like that, looking for ways to basically, stack paper, save money.
Yeah.
And that work ethic is something that Florida has benefited on through most of its boom. But this is something where the industry groups are quiet on this. Why didn't the builders and contractors, which endorsed Republicans up and down the ballot, say anything during the years in which E-Verify and other type reforms are being used to basically crack down on their labor source?
Yeah.
Same with agriculture. The agriculture industry has been silent about this,
Yeah.
pretending like there's no impacts. They pass the impacts on to the consumer, but that's not a tenable situation. And I think when the history of this era in Florida is written, you're going to wonder, or at least I'm going to wonder, why the industry groups, the stakeholders, quote unquote, were so silent on issues that were deleterious to how people actually live in the state.
Well, that will be the question. And just as a postscript to that, I always encourage folks to go down to Okeechobee and travel that will be just south of town, where they have a rodeo set up there about once a month, especially from spring to fall. And the Brahma Bull is the mascot of the high school, and they're nothing but Brahma Bulls in just about every pasture. And all of the cowboys are Latino. And
Right.
I don't mean they're coming from, I don't mean all of them are coming from Mexico or were born, but just about all the cowboys down there are Latino. It's an interesting contrast to see here in the state of Florida. One thing here: why is there any indication that Florida will move from red to purple, to at least purple, in the next election cycle or two? Is there any indication you see that we would move from at least red to purple?
Well, I mean, depending on how you look at it, I mean, if you look at the legislature itself, I mean, the reason the supermajority Republican is just because of redistricting. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. If you look at Democratic districts, I live in Angie Nixon's district, for example, it's basically D+30 over here. If you look at a Republican district adjoining it, like the one that, say, Wyman Duggan represents, that's more R+7, R+8. So the way they stack these formulae is to create a Democratic safe seat that, in fact, is so safe Republicans don't bother with it, but also creating Republican safe seats where they manipulate, swing voters into voting for their candidates or having no option. You might see a Democrat run with no money, or an independent, or a libertarian, somebody that's got no juice. I think when you look at the 2024 election, we've obviously got Rick Scott on the ballot, which is going to be a presidential race. I think you're going to see it being fairly competitive by, or purple, as you put it. Just because you will have that top of the ticket. It's not going to be like Charlie Crist trying to carry, a ticket down, over the finish line. It's going to be Joe Biden and the Democratic machine. It's going to be more of a traditional election. But Democrats did themselves no favors in 2022. Obviously, that was a tough primary between Charlie Crist and Nikki Fried. They didn't really heal afterwards. So a lot of those Nikki Fried voters, who'd be your younger demographic voters, they might have stayed home. And there wasn't really good exit polling in that election, because when you've got a 20-point election, you don't get a lot of exit polling from it. It's pretty much understood that Charlie Crist is going to lose, and lose badly. So there wasn't a lot of drama there. But I would not say that I expect the Democratic Party to suddenly become competent under Chair Nikki Fried, any more so than it has under others. But I think just by dint of demographics alone, 2024 is going to be a more competitive election in terms of Republicans versus Democrats than the one we had last year.
Let's move to Jacksonville for a minute here.
All right.
What are the key factors in the election of Donna Deegan as mayor? Person who, it didn't come totally out of nowhere, but I think the Republicans thought they'd have a pretty good chance of beating her down. What are the key factors in her getting elected mayor?
She had a lot of crossover vote. Obviously, Republicans didn't recover from the March election. You saw the Daniel Davis fight with Al Ferrero and with Leanna Cumber. And a lot of those voters didn't come home after that, because it was very much like, it was almost like a Republican primary before that March election. So Davis wasn't able to bring people home. Donna Deegan had a message that was able to pick up Republicans. They actually had to turn out edge. Republicans did, but it didn't matter because independents seemed to go strongly for Deegan. And she seemed to draw about 20% of Republicans. I don't know if she repeats that in 2027, but it happened this time around. You saw sort of a downstream effect in, the race with Jason Fisher and Joyce Morgan. Where Jason Fisher, he played the DeSantis Republican, law and order property appraiser, that kind of thing. It didn't really fly with voters. But if you look at the city council, you got a supermajority Republican city council. And you're going to have one or two of those people looking to run for mayor in 2027. Could be Terrence Freeman, the rules chair. Could be Nick Howland, the finance chair. Somebody like that. Obviously, the last time a Democratic mayor, you had two Republicans from the city council look seriously at it, and one, Bill Bishop, actually ran. So that's going to splinter the vote. Donna Deegan's big challenge, obviously, is to keep her coalition together. It's going to be interesting to see how she plays that. She hasn't said a lot of critical things about Ron DeSantis, for example. She's been sort of positive as much as she could be. She got a little bit spirited when Randy DeFore's nomination was up and clearly wasn't going to get through. She blamed Lenny Curry's machine for scuttling that nomination. And I think Deegan's interest would be to avoid these kind of pointless battles with the city council. What was obvious after the Randy DeFore and Al Ferrero nominations fell short was that you're not going to be able to convince the city council to accept somebody they don't want to accept for whatever reason. So watching her moving forward is going to be interesting. I don't think she's going to be able to be a capital D Democrat that often. Sure, I expect her to appear with Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee is next year. But, in terms of actually playing the partisan role, it's sort of like Alvin Brown. Alvin Brown did not go out of his way to embrace the Obama administration. In fact, he spent a lot of time courting Rick Scott to no avail.
And
when
he paid the price for it on the
he
election.
did, but you can see the strategy. I mean, it's like who actually got Alvin Brown elected? I mean, you had independents come over, you had Republicans come over, and he seemed to believe he could hold that coalition together. Even, ahead of the election with Lenny Curry, he went and met with the Tea Party. I don't think Donna Deegan's going to go that far, but it's going to be interesting to see how she plays it because the record of a Democratic mayor in the 21st century is not a strong one, and I think in some ways she's better positioned to get reelected. But there should be a lot of unforced errors in this administration too. I mean, you've obviously got the nominations that didn't pan out. So you have to deal with the Jaguar Stadium negotiation. That's a big mess that Lenny Curry left her. Obviously, when the Lot J deal fell apart, that seemed to put the brakes on any other negotiations between the Curry administration and city government. And it was left, the negotiations were happening between Mark Lamping and Brian Hughes, the former chief administrative officer. But, while they basically had a proposal, it wasn't a proposal that Curry advanced. So Deegan's going to have to advance something, and you can expect the city council to pick it apart. A, for populist reasons, B, for the fact that it is a big chunk of city money that's going to be financed at high interest rates for like 30 years or whatever it is. That's going to cut out a lot of the city's borrowing capacity for other infrastructure projects. And so you're going to see that come into play also, as well as just a political thing. I mean, if you got a Democratic mayor saying, all right, let's spend money for a billionaire, some Republicans are going to take advantage of the optics there.
All right. And then as we move down Bay Street, there is the top elected Republican official who just happens to be sheriff.
Yeah.
I think that some of the factors of getting him elected are relatively obvious, but is he facing a pretty smooth ride?
Well, the UNF approval poll says he's at 65%. So far it's so good. I mean, he's had issues to deal with. Obviously, the racist shooting at the Dollar General this summer, Jacksonville's murders in general, police brutality that happened this last weekend as we speak. That was, national news. But so far, TK Waters seems Teflon. What does he do with his political capital? That's the big question. People in the know say he's not interested in running for mayor as of right now. But, if I'm sitting there with 65% approval rating and I've got one more term as sheriff, I might think about running for mayor in 2027. I'm certainly thinking about it in 2031. That's very hard to beat an incumbent sheriff in the city. And TK Waters, he's not the most exciting public speaker, but he seems to inspire confidence in people. He seems to have buy-in. He's obviously using Tim Baker as a political consultant, which, Baker's had more wins than losses in this area. So I'm curious to see what he does going forward. He definitely has political capital to do something.
All right. AG, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. One more question.
All right.
What does AG stand for?
That's a great question. That's, no comment.
Why am I not surprised? A.G. Gancarski, journalist extraordinaire, currently writing for FloridaPolitics.com. You can also catch his commentary in Jacksonville Today, an online publication. A.G., it was a pleasure. I'm glad you were able to make time for us today, and looking forward to this as a to be continued conversation.
Absolutely. It's great talking to you, Fred.